we'll alternate the questions. 2 minutes for a response and 1 minute rebuttal. So the first question will start with Ms. Teachout, and it has to do with businesses and in particular the Hudson Valley region. Could you talk to us specifically about some of your plans to help what we consider to be the lifeblood of our small business economy, the small and medium businesses that comprise the chamber? 2 minutes.
And do you want me to come up here?
Please, yes, if you would.
Thank you for the question. I also see the independent business, the small, medium-sized business as the lifeblood of the economy. And in fact, thank you for the question, I brought my 7-point plan. And we have copies over here. John? That's John, he works with me. We have 50 copies or so. So you can go in greater depth and look at the sort of key elements of what I believe we need to do to support our independent business community. The first is we gotta make sure that there's access to capital. Ulster Savings Bank does an incredible job. But I've talked to so many independent businesses who have struggled to get loans from some of the bigger banks. I was talking to somebody in Uptown the other day who has been 4 years in the black and still couldn't get a loan from any of the big banks. Very happy to have the support of Ulster Savings Bank, but we bailed out the big banks and they're not lending to our independent businesses. After the financial crash of 2008, I co-founded a citizen-based group. We brought citizens to Washington, D.C. to say, we've got to get the big banks to lend more. We've got to make sure that if we're going to bail them out, they actually are doing their job. That's part one. There's 6 other parts. I'm not going to have time to go through all of them, but I just want to mention a few. One is property taxes are out of control. They're way too high. I haven't gone anywhere without talking to people about the out-of-control property taxes. And this is an area where John and I agree, that the root issue here is that the state should not make counties pay for Medicaid reimbursement. It's really, really killing our local communities. We've got to do something about that. Healthcare costs are also out of control. And again, the way I approach things is always to say, what's the root issue? What's really happening here? And what's really happening with our healthcare costs is basically big pharma. And I'm done with time, but I may have a little more time to talk about that. But our 7-point plan is going to be over here, and all of you can take a look at it after the discussion this morning.
What can we do to help small business? Well, we need tax and regulatory relief. The last 7.5 years, both from Albany and Washington, we've seen massive amounts of new regulatory burdens coming on small businesses. I've talked to the ARC here in Ulster and Greene counties. The fact is that they can't afford the $15 minimum wage that my opponent supports. There's no state reimbursement for it. What we should do for small business, incentivize investment. I would like to see 100% write-off in the year you make the investment for machinery, tools, equipment, vehicles, computers. Year one, if you don't have enough tax liability to write it off fully in year one, you roll it over to year 2. The notion that we would have the federal government intrude itself into lending decisions of banks is a real mistake. That is the federal politicization of lending. I would rather have Jim Davenport and his colleague at Ulster Savings Bank and Roundout and Bank of Greene County, I'd rather have them make the decision as to what's a bankable loan. I think the worst thing we possibly could do is to say the federal government is going to force a bank to do something. You know what? What it should be doing is easing the burden that Dodd-Frank, for instance, has put on local community banks. I've not talked to a single community banker in this district who's not told me about the added regulatory burden, the added compliance costs, the added difficulty with actually performing their job. One banker in Schoharie County said to me, I've hired all these people to do new compliance. It costs us a lot more money. It makes it more difficult for us to lend. And what they do is they prepare reports to the government that nobody reads. The Bank of Ulster County, Ulster Savings Bank, Roundout, the Bank of Greene County, they were not the cause of the financial meltdown. And yet Dodd-Frank is killing every local banker. If you doubt that, ask Jim Davenport and others after this meeting today. You'll find out The regulatory burden is hurting small business lending.
Do you want a 1 minute rebuttal?
Well, we're yet again finding an area of agreement. One of the sort of key parts of my 7-point plan is reducing the red tape. And every business owner, I was talking to a friend of mine who was saying, look, I didn't go into business to fill out forms. That isn't the point. As somebody who was, again, a citizen trying to fight after the financial crisis to make sure that we got sort of money flowing back into our community, I can tell you one of the reasons that community banks are burdened with these burdens that don't make any sense for for our community banks is because the lobbyists for the big banks were pushing for regulations that actually are totally different when they're applied to the small community bank and when they're applied to the big bank. And that's true across the board. You see that in area after area where the big companies will hire lobbyists to push regulations that don't make any sense for the independent business or the small business, but are actually nothing for the larger business. And one of the things that I'm going to fight against is reducing the power of lobbyists in Washington.
Faso, 1 minute rebuttal.
Well, the proof is in the pudding. You know, the National Federation of Independent Business, the largest small business advocacy organization, has endorsed my candidacy. The New York State Business Council, the largest organization promoting business and common sense tax and regulatory practices here in New York State, has endorsed my candidacy. The Manufacturers Association here in the Hudson Valley in the state has endorsed my candidacy. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has endorsed my candidacy. And there's one reason all of these business groups have endorsed my candidacy is because I'm offering real, practical tax and regulatory reforms that will help small business and large business employ people here in New York State and here in America. That's really what we've got to do. Property tax relief, I'm glad my opponent has copied my plan. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. I came out with this plan finally to end Nelson Rockefeller's 50-year mistake of imposing the Medicaid burden on the counties. Elliot Auerbach and all the county officials can tell you about it. I've got a plan to do it.